Welcome everyone. Today I am speaking about communication competencies, the language and communication skills for regulated work environment. Realizing that some of you might be from non-regulated work environments, I'm also going to touch on that non-regulated sector as well. My objective in this webinar is to make some connections between language proficiency and professional communication competencies. I want to make a point that communication is much more than language skills. Now, a little bit about Touchstone Institute. Touchstone Institute develops competency evaluation programs for regulators in Ontario's healthcare sector. We also develop and administer occupation-specific language proficiency exams through my department, the communication program. These language proficiency exams exist because language proficiency is a requirement for licensure or professional registration for many healthcare professions in Ontario. So we offer this customized exam for nurses as an alternative to IELTS. Touchstone Institute does not provide services directly to clients. You must be referred to us by a regulator or a university. Okay, so just to clarify before we begin, today we're discussing interpersonal communication skills, how we create and transfer, receive, interpret, and respond to messages in order to achieve our professional goals. We're not talking about corporate communications, how an organization communicates with its clients and stakeholders to achieve its goals. So today it's all about you and how you communicate and how you could communicate better.
I would like to give you some background on professional regulation in Ontario. Many professions in Ontario are regulated, and in Canada we have a very particular model of regulation. Ontario legislation, that means the law, governs certain professions to protect the public interest. These professions are regulated by something that we call usually a college, and that language is pretty interesting because you might think it's an educational institution, but it isn't. So a couple of examples are the College of Nurses of Ontario regulate nursing, and the Ontario Association of Architects regulates architecture. In Ontario, there are 26 regulated health professions, 15 non-health professions which are regulated, and 22 trades that are regulated. So when your profession is regulated, it means that you must apply for a license or professional certification before you can practice. To become licensed or registered, it's necessary to demonstrate that your education and training meets Ontario standards. Regulators describe the competencies required for licensure and professional registration. They work with training institutions in Ontario. And what's important for you to know is that these are called entry to practice requirements, and you might get some ideas about communication skills for professional practice through these entry to practice competencies. The legislation's pretty hard to read, but these entry to practice competencies are usually very accessible, and most regulators have these on their websites. So here are some of the requirements, and it'll vary depending on the college or association you're applying to. As you know, WES does the credentials evaluation, and that's the blue wording at the top left. You may be asked to provide results of a language proficiency test. In healthcare, we do a lot of performance-based assessments. You might even have a regulator that conducts peer review interviews, or you may have to write a professional competency exam, and some regulators are moving towards portfolio-based assessments. In all of these situations and in all of these types of assessments, communication is valued and assessed because it is a professional competency. Now let's take an example. This is an example for physicians or doctors, and this is a quote from the Ontario Medicine Act. That means this is the legislation here in this province. Now there's a lot of detail there, but what I think is interesting for this talk is D. This is saying that it's a non-exemptable standard and qualification, so it's an absolute requirement of certificate of registration that a physician can communicate effectively and will display an appropriate professional attitude. So if this is in the legislation, you can imagine that a regulator is responsible for ensuring that all applicants can demonstrate these types of skills. Additionally, the Medicine Act stipulates that a candidate must be reasonably fluent in English or French. This slide is just illustrating that the language proficiency requirements exist sometimes in the legislation as well. So regulated professions have the legal responsibility to ensure that applicants meet these standards. An easy way to find out if yours is a regulated profession in Ontario is to visit the Ontario Fairness Commissioner's website. The web address is here, www.fairnesscommissioner.ca, and you can look under Professions and Trades. In Ontario, the Fairness Commissioner tries to work with regulators to make sure that registration is fair for international applicants as well as Canadian students. And if you have additional questions about other provinces, you should be aware that most Canadian provinces will have some online information for immigrants, and in Ontario, that website is www.ontarioimmigration.ca. These links can often provide you with information and link you to programs that exist in the province. So non-regulated professions are also not governed by legislation, pardon me, but are often overseen by agencies that do articulate competencies. So these professions also have defined competencies, including communication competencies. A general resource to help you understand what might be involved in these competencies for non-regulated professions is the Conference Board of Canada's employability skills. What's interesting about the Conference Board is that it's the voice of employers and recruiters, so this gives you a good idea of their views. So here's an example of what they consider a fundamental skill for their employees. And you can see in the green square that communication is a really critical part of their requirements. This is a good resource, this Conference Board of Canada Employability Skills 2000, if you're interested in learning more about the soft skills that are valued in Canadian workplaces. So I recommend it as a guideline. So for thinking about non-regulated professions, one of the things that might help you understand or realize the importance of communication might be looking at an employment website. So here are some quotes that we got online based on some job ads. So let's take the example of a website designer. You might make the assumption that if you're working as a website designer, communication is not that critical. Of course, technical skills such as designing and planning are critical, but also teamwork, internet presence, and verbal communication. And this involves a number of different language skills and also understanding of communication competencies. Let's take a look at a veterinary technician. While you're working with animals, you might assume that perhaps your technical skills are key, but how important are communication skills? Well, again, we can see that verbal communication is something that we're looking for. Now, a neurobiologist, I thought this was an interesting example because you might think of this person as someone who must have strong science background and research skills, but also verbal communication and written communication are critical. In summary, both regulated and unregulated professions or occupations have defined competencies for the workplace. It's a good idea to be familiar with these and reflect on how your skills and experience match up with the standards described. In interviews, you may be required to describe an example demonstrating that you are a good communicator. So communication competencies are considered to be soft skills, and this is contrasted with hard skills or technical skills. Soft skills are highly valued by employers and are often the factors that determine retention of newly hired employees.